What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to Clutch Talk. Episode 11 today. Again, continuing our breakdown of each college football team or as many as we can get through. And today will be Illinois and Alabama. Alabama has extremely high expectations after a disappointing year last year, not making the playoff under Kalen DeBoer. And Illinois also has high expectations this year under Brett Bielema with a lot of retention, a lot of key pieces returning. After a 10-win season last year, they expect a big jump again this upcoming season. If you're new to the channel and like the content, subscribe to the channel. Got a lot more teams coming soon, and then we're also going to start mixing in quarterback rankings, running back rankings, offensive line rankings, coach rankings, and all that stuff before we get to our season predictions. So be on the look for that. And with that, we're going to get started today. I want to start with Illinois. Illinois, keyword again is retention. They returned Luke Altmyer, the quarterback, third year in the system. He transferred from Ole Miss 3 years ago, and he's steadily improved. His first year at Illinois was not that impressive, but he was actually really good last year. 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, took care of the ball, was efficient, good game manager. And he's got the same offensive coordinator for the third straight year, which I think is a big deal. And he's the headliner of that offense, right? Everything runs through him. He's the guy that makes the engine run. Other key returners, though, if you look at the chart here, offensive tackle J.C. Davis had a B grade last year, played 99% of the snaps. He's going to be the blindside protector on the offensive line. And then center Josh Kreutz had 97% of the snaps and a B-minus grade. The offensive line's returning 4 of the 5 starters, so they're going to be a very experienced group, and they should improve from where they were last year. And then if you look at the transfers that they brought in, they lose a lot of their top receivers from last year. So they went into the portal and got Hudson Clement out of West Virginia. He had 741 yards. And then they went and got Justin Bowick out of Ball State, who had 383 yards, also wide receiver. So that kind of headlines like the key returners and key transfers that they were able to bring in last year. As a team last year, though, running the ball was good but not great. You expect with a Brett Bielema team that's going to be ground and pound, physical, get under center, eye form, like let's play smash mouth football. And that wasn't really the case last year. And I don't think it's going to be the case this year, but I think they're going to try their best to get back to that with Aiden Lowry at the running back position. And again, with the offensive line was just okay last year. They weren't anything special, but I think they could be pretty good this next upcoming season. Again, returning a lot, very experienced group up front. And again, with you replacing top 2 wide receivers too, I think they're going to need to rely more on the ground game early on, especially until the receivers get settled in, until Luke Altmyer builds chemistry with those receivers. I think the ground game is going to have to be relied on a little bit more this upcoming season. But offensively, they took care of the ball last year. They didn't turn the ball over a whole lot, and they were able to get explosive plays. I think that's another thing they're going to have to do this year if they want to succeed. To me, though, third year in the system with Luke Altmyer is the big storyline, and how big of a jump he can, because he took a big jump from his year 1 at Illinois to year 2. Can he make that jump even bigger this year at Illinois? Looking at the defense. Defensively, some key returners. Gabe Jacas is the headliner. He had 13 tackles for loss, 8 sacks last year. He's the leader of that defense. He's the team captain of that defense. He's, again, the engine that makes it go. Corner Xavier Scott was really good last year. 6 pass deflections, 4 interceptions. That whole secondary is really good, including Matthew Bailey, who's at safety, had 94 tackles, 5 pass deflections, interception. Those are just 2 of the secondary guys. Their whole secondary is very experienced and loaded. They are loaded at that position, in my opinion. The transfers, they went and kind of rebuilt this defensive front because they lost a lot of the defensive front they had last year. They went and got James Thompson out of Wisconsin. He had 6 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, but that was in 2023. He actually missed all of 2024 with an injury. So that's a hash mark. He's from Wisconsin. We'll see how he does coming back from a big injury like that, missing the whole season. And they also got another Wisconsin defensive tackle on the interior. Kurt Neal had 4 tackles for loss and a sack last year. They're expecting big things out of him this year. Looking at the defensive group last year, though, the D-line grades weren't that good, and that's a concern considering they rebuilt that defensive front. And there's still questions along the defensive line, especially if James Thompson isn't what he was before the injury. How does that look? They struggled on first and second down, which led to them being really bad on third down. They were 113th in the country on third down last year. They were terrible on third down, and they were just average at forcing turnovers. They didn't generate a ton of turnovers, but I think that could change this year, just again with that secondary being more experienced. Because if we look at this year, I think the secondary is going to be one of the best in the Big Ten Conference. They may be the best in the Big Ten Conference. They're right up there with Oregon and Ohio State, in my opinion, with how good that secondary is, just with all their retention. In the pass rush, yes, it's still a question, but I think there is potential for it to be better than it was last year. And they return a ton, particularly in the secondary and in the linebacker room. The linebacker room is also very underrated. Could be really good this year as well. They got 7 defensive linemen from the portal. I named 2 of them with James Thompson and Kurt Neal. But they got 7 overall from the portal. That D-line, if they end up producing, could be a really deep room. But they are still a question mark. So I'm interested to see how that looks. But they're going to rely on that secondary this year, I think, to hold down that defense. If you want to look at numbers from last year, they were 86th in passing, 79th in rushing, 92nd total is their offensive numbers, 64th in scoring, 93rd in sacks allowed, 15th on third down, 53rd in the red zone. Numbers that won't blow you away, but I think it could take a jump this next year. Again, their offense was really bad Altmaier's first year. Got a little bit better this past year. And I think the offense could be even better this next year with him at quarterback. Defensively, they were 78th in passing, 65th in rushing, 68th in total. 31st in scoring, which is pretty good. 42nd in sacks. Again, like I said, 113th on third down was really bad. But it was more of a result of how bad they were on first and second down that led to them being bad on third down, 69th in the red zone. For a team that has as high expectations as they do, the numbers were not good last year. And they were in a lot of one-score games. People don't remember. They went to overtime with Purdue, who won one game last year. They won the game by a point. They went to overtime with Nebraska last year. They beat Kansas by 1 score. Michigan was 21-7, ugly game. Rutgers was 1-score game. Northwestern was a close game. South Carolina was a close game. So a lot of one-score games last year that could have dictated whether they went 6-6 or 10-3 like they did last year. So that's why the numbers, they don't look that good because, they were just fighting in a lot of close games last year. I don't think they can afford it. I think they could afford to do that, but I think that's why they're such a wild card in terms of like trendy pick versus non-trendy pick. Just because they're, again, a lot of close games last year. Looking at the schedule, it is a very workable schedule. I will say that. It is a very workable schedule. They don't have to play Oregon. They don't have to play Penn State. They don't even have to play Michigan. It is a very, very workable schedule. They get USC at home. Their toughest road game is at Indiana. You could say at Washington potentially too, but those two are your toughest road games. And then you get even Ohio State at home. Now, I don't think you're going to beat Ohio State, but getting them at home is a big deal. And Illinois was a trendy pick to make the college football playoff as a big team. There people are looking at them at how they looked at Indiana last year. Now, I don't necessarily see that, but we'll see, I guess, because my record predictions we're going to look. I think the worst they can do is 7-5, just because, again, the schedule's easy, and that'd be you lose at Duke. They have to play at Duke week 2, at Indiana, USC, Ohio State, and at Washington or at Wisconsin. I think that's the worst they can do. Altmaier's going to keep them in a lot of games this year. I think Hudson Clement's a very slept-on wide receiver that could have a big year in that system as a go-to wide receiver. I think the offensive line's going to improve. But there is still a question around the defensive front. The run game itself was not that productive last year. Can it keep it up? And if it doesn't, 7-5 is the worst-case scenario, and it could happen. Now, the best to me is 11-1. And that would mean Altmaier takes this huge jump, becomes like the Big Ten Player of the Year. And let's say the run game goes back to what Bielema's was when he had Chase Brown at running back. And let's say the defensive front's not a problem. I think the only game they lose is Ohio State at home, and they go 11-1, and that will put them potentially either the Big Ten championship game or the college football playoff. But I don't think that's extremely likely. I think the best is 9-3. People are trending them to be 10-2, make the playoff. I just don't see it because I think, you lose to Ohio State, but then either at Duke, at Indiana, USC, or at Washington. One of those 4 games, I think they dropped 2 of them. Because you were in just so many one-score games last year, that kind of inflated the record that I just don't know if they can keep that up this year. Even though their schedule's easier than it was last year, I just don't see them doing that. Because, again, they had to play Penn State, Oregon, and Michigan last year. Very difficult schedule. They don't have that this year, but I just think it's going to be harder to win some one-score games and do that back-to-back years, in my opinion, unless they just got that much better. So with that being said, I think most likely is 9-3 because Altmaier still's got to be a little bit more consistent. The run game's got to get a little bit better, and the defensive front has to be a lot better than it was last year. So 9-3 is most likely for Illinois, which is actually a really good season for Illinois, especially if they win the bowl game. But I'm not buying the whole playoff hype from Illinois just because it's with them having all the pressure on them now and not being like the slept-on team. I don't think they handle it well, and I think 9-3 is the most likely. So now we're going to switch to Alabama. Year 2 under Kalen DeBoer. Extremely hot start to the season where, we were talking Jalen Miller was going to win the Heisman and all that stuff. They beat Georgia, whatever. And then they kind of fall a little bit from grace and, they lose 3 games, right? Not ideal. Obviously not ideal. However, I think they could be lethal this next season. And I'm talking lethal. Ryan Williams, obviously headlines that offense. He was extremely dynamic last year, 865 yards, 8 touchdowns. And then Caden Proctor is going to be a top 10 draft pick at the offensive tackle position. He's back, has played 76% of the snaps, had an A grade. And then Jeremy Bernard at wide receiver as well at 794 yards. Their receiver room is going to be so good this next year, which is going to help Ty Simpson, who's projected to be the starting quarterback, replacing Jalen Milroe. And they're going to help him out along with, I think, the offensive line improving this next year is going to help him as well. And if you look at the transfers, they got another receiver from Miami and Isaiah Horton who had 616 yards. They get Brody Dalton out of the portal from Troy, had 188 yards, 3 touchdowns. He'll be with C.J. Dupree at the tight end position. And then they got a backup running back in Jalen Washington from Louisiana who had 485 yards last year that I think could be pretty good. He'll be the backup behind Jam Miller, but him and Jam Miller will be sharing a backfield. That could be a pretty good backfield. It needs to be because they could not run the ball last year. And that's what I'm really going to talk about. The struggles from Alabama last year, right? They couldn't take care of the football, a lot of interceptions and fumbles. They struggled to run the ball. And that's something you don't hear from Alabama much, them struggling to run the football. They just couldn't do it last year. And they didn't have any consistency on the offensive side. One LSU game was great, with Jalen Miller running all over the team. Georgia game was great. But then you have games like you did against Tennessee, like you did against Oklahoma. And you think that's got to get fixed this year if you're Alabama. And you can't be relying on Jalen. Like they had to rely on Jalen Miller last year to make a bunch of plays. You can't rely on Ryan Williams to make crazy plays for you to win games. You got to have a collective group effort. You don't ask too much of Ty Simpson. Just ask him to make plays when he needs to. Be a complementary football team. If you can do that, the offense can get better. But they got to be better in the run game, I think, for all that to start. The offensive line, though, this next year could be a top 15 unit. I really believe that. That offensive line could be a top 15 unit. And Ty Simpson at quarterback, obviously, is the headliner. And then Ryan Grubb is back at offensive coordinator. That's a big deal. He was the offensive coordinator when Washington went to the national title game. He was at the Seattle Seahawks last year as their play caller. He's back at Alabama. And that helps Kalen DeBoer tremendously. Because I think the offense will cater to being complimentary and will cater to Ty Simpson's strengths and weaknesses more. And again, it'll be more complimentary. They're going to want to run the football more. They're going to instill physicality at the line of scrimmage. And they're going to want their receivers to make plays in the open field. And that's, I think, what fits Alabama this year. That's where their strengths are. And so that'll be very interesting. Defensively, we're going to switch over to defensively. LT Overton at defensive end is a problem. He's a game record. 2 tackles for loss, 2 sacks last year. Doesn't really do the numbers justice for how impactful he was last year and how impactful he's going to be this year on that defensive line. And then that secondary is going to be really good. Damani Jackson, 7 pass deflections, 2 interceptions last year, and Keon Sabb, 4 pass deflections, 2 interceptions last year. That's not even naming Bray Hubbard and other guys in that secondary that could be really good. Transfer-wise, they got a big linebacker get from Colorado, Nakai Hill Green. 12 tackles for loss, 4 pass deflections, and 2 interceptions. And then Cam Calhoun, a corner out of Utah, had 9 pass deflections, 1 interception, just to add to the corner room that they already had that's so good. So kind of headlines Alabama's defensive guys. Last year they were really good at generating pressure. They forced a lot of turnovers. Problem was they struggled to be disciplined and with penalties. Again, the main one was 15 against Tennessee. Like that can't happen if you want to win. My question for them this year, you have LT Overton, Tim Keenan, obviously on the defensive front, but who else is going to step up and be a consistent pass rusher? Because Alabama's defensive group last year as a front seven was really good at generating pressure. I'm very curious to see if they can do that again this year, or at least keep that up, the numbers somewhat up. The secondary to me, though, is going to be top 3 in college football. That corner and safety group, adding Cam Calhoun, that secondary to me is going to be top 3 in college football. I'll stand by that. They do need to be a little bit better at stopping the run, though, and again, that comes with how the defensive front's going to improve from what it was last year. Because there were times last year where they just got gashed on the ground, and I don't think you can allow that to happen this year if you want to be a defense. But I think overall Alabama's defense is going to be much better than it was last year, and it could be a top 10, top 5 group. Looking at the numbers from last year, though, 56th in passing, 47th in rushing, 42nd total, 22nd in scoring, 61st in the sacks, 12th on third down, 6th in the red zone. I think the sacks numbers could change drastically. I think the offensive line again is going to be a lot better. And I think they're going to run the ball a lot more. And I think they're going to get a complementary offense is the key here. Defensively, they were pretty good last year. 19th in passing, 40th in rushing, 21st in total, 10th in scoring, 69th in sacks, 16th on third down, and 31st in the red zone. Overall, very good. They are going to need more of a pass rush, like I said, and I think the run defense has to be a little bit better than it was last year, and that comes on the defensive front. Nakai Hill-Green, I think, helps with that a lot, too. They're going to blitz him a lot. He reads the run game better than almost any linebacker in the country. So we'll see how he does there. But that kind of wraps up Alabama. Again, Ryan Grubb being back is a big deal. And again, Kalen DeBoer, I think, feels almost better with Ty Simpson and with the overall team he has. Because, again, he doesn't have to rely on one player like Jalen Miller last year. If he wasn't running the ball or making crazy plays, they weren't winning. Or weren't even being successful. And with Ty Simpson and with the group he has this year, a receiver and offensive line, they can be more complementary and win games in more ways than they could last year. They can win, I think, this year by smash mouthing the football. They can win this game by Ty Simpson, throwing 30 passes. They can win this game with defense. They can win this game with just pounding with that offensive line. So there's more ways for Alabama to win this year than there was last year. With that being said, I think the worst they can do is 8-4. That's the worst. And that would be like Ty Simpson is just terrible. The offensive line's terrible. And let's say the run game's still not there and even gets worse. You could lose at Georgia, lose at Tennessee at home, lose at South Carolina, and lose to LSU. I would say even like 7-5 if you lose at Auburn, but I'm going to leave it at that, 8-4. The best is obviously 12-0. Ryan Grubb makes this big difference. And their schedule, they play Georgia on the road, South Carolina on the road, but they get LSU at home, they get Tennessee at home. So I think I could see 12-0 being there. Most likely I'm going to say 10-2. I'm close to saying 11-1 because I'm really high on this Alabama team this year with that defense especially and the receiver room. But I'm just going to say 10-2, and that would be like you lose to Georgia, let's say, and then you lose to either Tennessee, South Carolina, or LSU, one of those. Or even you lose the Iron Bowl. That's possible too. But 10-2, I'm going to say the most likely, which would get them in the playoff. Could get them to the SEC title game. I'm not quite sure. And, yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I think 10-2 is most likely. Get them in the playoff, continue to build momentum for Kalen DeBoer. It would kind of shut a lot of people up, especially if he went on a deep playoff run. Would quiet the doubters of Kalen DeBoer. But that wraps that up, and that'll also wrap up our video. I changed the format up a little bit. Hope you all like that a little bit better. And next video, I believe we're going to do Arizona State and Michigan. Two teams not really talk about a whole lot. Arizona State went to the playoff last year. They're returning a lot. Sam Leavitt's probably the best quarterback in the conference. Jordan Tyson's one of the best receivers in the country. And then Michigan, 8-5 last year. Bryce Underwood potentially at quarterback. Could be a brand new offense this year, a lot better of an offense. The defense still going to be really good over there. And their schedule's workable enough to where they could have a really good year next year. But yeah, that'll wrap up our video today. Again, if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Helps a lot. Notice like 90% of people who are watching the video aren't subscribed to the channel. Don't know what's up with that, but if that's you, fix it. And yeah, I'll see y'all later.